All right, we are talking about Karl Barth. I gave you a quick introduction to him yesterday. The one thing I think I neglected to mention, which is part of the reason we're going to spend a little time on him, is that he would be regarded by many, including your teacher, as probably, as certainly the single most influential theologian, Christian theologian of the 20th century. That doesn't mean everybody likes it. We're just talking straight influence. He had a huge influence on the Christian world in the 20th century. And that alone makes him worthy of our attention and consideration. So that's part of why I'm going to tell you a little bit of his story in some detail so that you have familiarity with it, because you will certainly come across him again, and whether he's someone you really like or not, at least you'll have some appreciation for him. So, Karl Barth, born 1889 in Basel. He was always proud of his Swiss roots because he always considered himself a good Calvinist. Of course, Calvin in Geneva was one of the more famous people in the tradition of that land. He spent his early life in Bonn. He was trained, as I've already told you, as a liberal Christian theologian. That was his upbringing, and he had no objection to it during the early years of his growth and education. But in 1914, what happened in 1914, by the way? That's somewhat decisive in 20th century history. 1914 is famous because it is... Go ahead.
Well, I was thinking it was World War I.
Yeah, that's good. That's exactly what it is. So in the beginnings of World War I, Barth...
Is there a meeting with a new family? I think.
There you go. See.
Well, can you be good? Now just
No.
hear me out.
No, sorry. Just save it. Sometime today you'll have this opportunity. So he was reacting in 1914, and really in the run-up to the First World War, he was reacting to his liberal teachers who supported German war aims, you see. The liberal teachers were on board supporting the German war for conquest. And in 1914, Barth published what was called the Manifesto. I'm sorry, I misstated that. In 1914, scratch the Barth part. In 1914, a document was published entitled Manifesto of 93 German Intellectuals to the Civilized World. Okay, Manifesto of the 93 German Intellectuals to the Civilized World. It was 1914. Some of his own liberal teachers had signed this document.
Could you repeat the title?
I will. The Manifesto of the 93 German Intellectuals to the Civilized World. That's the title of it. Signed by some of the most prestigious thinkers in Germany, including some of his own liberal teachers, Christians, who supported Germany's war of conquest. Believing that Germany was the most enlightened country in the world and represented the greatest and most brilliant expression of Christian virtue, were perfectly warranted to go and help the rest of the world see that at the point of a sword or at the barrel of a gun. Kind of like Alexander the Great, who thought he was saving the world, by sweeping through, giving everybody Greek civilization. The Germans thought they were saving the world by going out and exporting militarily this Greek culture. And many of his Christian thinkers thought that they were doing this thoroughly within the spirit of a Christian understanding. Barth thought, I don't think so. This did not make so much sense to him. He believed that his teachers had been misled. I'm kind of reading this statement to you because I want you to hear it as accurately as I can say it. He believed that his teachers had been misled by a theology that tied God too closely to the best expressions of humanity. He believed his teachers had been misled by a theology that tied God too closely to the best expressions of humanity. And that would mean that they could see God as endorsing this war effort by Germany. God is in the German camp, sponsoring the German efforts. This is always tempting. If I can just drop to a little footnote here. We are American, and we, of course, as Americans, especially as Christians, like to look back at our roots as Americans and think, well, look, we started as a Christian nation, and we still have some of that Christian sort of outlook that continues to be part of our cultural underpinnings, although not nearly as much as it used to be, but, it's still there. And I've certainly met people, Christian people, who have the same kind of temptation to confuse anything American with anything Christian. You know what I'm saying? You kind of lose the distinction. Oh, if it's American, it's Christian. Or if it's Christian, it's American. Well, maybe, but don't just take that sort of superficially. Not everything American is Christian. And it's not that Christ would endorse every American policy in the world. There are two different things going on here, It's easy to do that. And Germany seems to have done that. And that's what Barth was getting concerned about, was he saw this sort of huge commitment to the German cause as being almost synonymous with the Christian cause. And so he began to think about that and object to it. So anyway, that was in 1914. In 1911, just backing up a little bit, he got married. He married Nellie Hoffman. And they had 4 children. He was a pastor for 10 years, from 1911 to 1921. So, of course, the First World War breaks out in the middle of his time as a pastor. (1911), so 10 years, 1911 to 1921. Pastor in a Reformed church. Always considered himself very much a part of the Reformed tradition, Reformed Church of Switzerland. In 1921, he published this book, and then it was republished in 1922, called Romer Brief. I mentioned it yesterday. And the basic premise of the book is that the God who is revealed in the cross of Christ overthrows any attempt to ally God with any human culture, achievement, or possession. Just try to get that down. It's worth reflecting on, but just get it down in that language. The God who is revealed in the cross of Christ challenges and overthrows any attempt to tie God with human culture, human achievement, human possession. Can you think of anything in the Bible that would sort of substantiate that idea? Anything that anywhere in the Bible that Barth might use as a text to argue that particular idea? Anything come to mind? The cross of Christ is the point where God challenges and overthrows any attempt to tie God to human culture, human achievement, anything like that. Where do you suppose Barth might go in the Bible to make that argument? Pretty well-known text I have in mind here, but there may be others. Go ahead, Spencer.
Well, this isn't when he was on the cross, but when he's talking to Pilate, Pilate says something about do you know how much power I have? And then Jesus responds by saying, my kingdom is not of this world.
Yeah.
If you knew where I was from.
Okay, that's right. Certainly that. Nicole.
Would be just to be in the world but not of it.
Certainly you have that idea, but I'm thinking of something where the cross is specifically mentioned in connection with a statement that could take you in this direction. That's good. Both of those are good thoughts. I'm thinking of what Paul says to the Corinthians, chapter 1 of the letter to the Corinthians, and he says, the preaching of the cross is to those who are perishing foolishness, but to us who are being saved is the power of God. And then he goes through kind of this litany. He says, what? There's three major cultures in the world when Paul is writing. All right? What are the three major cultures in the world besides the Jewish culture in the world when Paul is writing? The cultures are, what's one of them? Sydney, one of the major cultures in the first century in the world was? Roman. Another was, what? Anybody? Sarah? Greek. Oh, we'll add the Jew. I guess I want to add that as a matter of fact. Paul goes through in chapter 1 of Romans and talks about how the cross is offensive to the highest values of each of these. To the Jew, you see, the cross is a scandal, he says. It's an offense. To the Greek, the cross is what? What's the term he used? To the Greeks, the preaching of the cross is? Ben?
Was it foolishness?
Foolishness. He doesn't mention the Romans by name, but they're clearly there impliedly. He says that the Romans who celebrated nobility, kind of that military sort of image and so on, it is base. And it's like he systematically goes through and talks about how the cross is an offense to everything that each of these cultures holds most dear. And that's why they all are put off by it. That's why they all find it to be so objectionable. What does the Greek see in the cross? The Greek celebrates Plato. Plato can think high, lofty thoughts about an ideal world. And you show him a guy dying on a Roman cross, and the Greek just, come on. We can do Socrates. It's much better than that. It's foolish. The Romans, they like people like Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, great military characters, Pompey, And so what do you show? You show them the image of Jesus drawing on a cross. How impressed is a Roman with that? Yeah. It's nauseating. The Jewish people, they like power. The Jews look for signs, Paul says. They like miracles. They like to see the splitting of the Red Sea. They like to see great displays of, Elijah calling fire down on Mount Carmel. That's what the Jews want to do. You show them Jesus dying on a cross. What do they make of that? Nothing powerful there. It's weakness. It's foolish. It is offensive to everything that this world celebrates. So get used to it. There's an offense to the cross. When you go out and try to sell the message of Christ dying on a cross to a pagan culture, the first response you're going to get is basically ridicule. That's stupid. You telling me you're staking your meaning in life on some Jew dying on a cross 2,000 years ago? Give me a break. There's better things to be thinking about than that. You know, that's kind of the... And what Barth felt was happening was that the fundamental offense of the cross was being traded away for a kind of humanistic celebration of all things German. The cross is lost in the shuffle, and God simply becomes part of this great, wonderful German movement, you know. The very kind of thing that would find the cross objectionable. And so Barth, you know, at that point, I think Barth is on to something. At this point, I want to hear him because I think his insight is pretty decent. And I think sometimes we evangelicals have been too hard on him for not appreciating that he's saying something there that we probably need to, you know, take seriously. So anyway, he dropped that little bomb in 1922, and it was so well written, so powerfully articulated his view that it just, one guy said, it sort of exploded like a little nuclear bomb on the playground of 19th century or early 20th century Christian theology. Nothing was going to be the same again, and he was immediately moved to a position as a professor of theology. So from 1921 to 35, he's a professor of theology. And so, of course, he's a professor of theology in Germany during the very years that Hitler's coming to power. You know. And everything that he was suspicious of leading up to the First World War is, of course, now flowering in the most incredible, you know, terms as we have the run up to the Second World War. Ben. Right.
Oh, can you just say the thing from Normal Brief again, the quote you had? The God who is revealed.
Yes. Let me give it to you one more time. The God who is revealed in the cross of Jesus challenges and overthrows any attempt to tie God to human culture, achievements, or possessions. That's not a quote from Barth, but it's a good summary of what he's doing. It's not a quote from me either. It's a quote from a commentator on Barth. Got that? All right, so during these years, Barth becomes tied to a group, and the group call themselves Dialectical theologians. This was called Dialectical theology. So that really is a term that begins to be used during these years, 21 to 35. There are others in this group. So these are names. There's more than these, but these would be the most important names you should note. They were all they were very diverse in their outlook, but they shared together this objection to liberalism. One was Rudolf Bultmann, whose name you should recognize. Another was Emil Brunner, B-R-U-N-N-E-R, Emil, E-I-E-M-I-L, Emil Brunner. Another that you may come across sometime is Edward Turnison, E-D-U-A-R-D, E-D-U-A-R-D, Turnison, T-H-U-R-N-E-Y-S-E-N. T-H-U-R-N-E-Y-S-E-N. If you do theological studies someday, you'll certainly come across all those names. You may come across some of them in other fields as well. So, as the Third Reich is rising in Germany, of course, Hitler is elected Chancellor in Germany in the year. What year does Hitler become Chancellor of Germany? Laura?
1933.
Correct. And of course, shortly after he's chancellor, by a little bit of hocus pocus in German politics, he also becomes the president, and he becomes virtually the absolute ruler of all German life. In 1934, just the next year, Barth, along with certain others, wrote a document called the Barmen Confession. Named for the little town where they met, known as Barmen. And this was a brief theological confessional statement that was a broadside attack on the rising Nazi movement in Germany. I think you need to understand, and probably you do understand, that the bulk of people, the bulk of the churches in Germany during the rise of Nazism signed off supporting Nazi aims. It's one of the most embarrassing chapters of Christian history is that so many Christian churches, institutional, national churches in Germany, basically endorsed Hitler in the early days. Most of them came to regret it, of course, as time went on. But at the time, it seemed that Germany was now, on the brink of a new dawning of a new day, and this man articulated German aims and hopes and destiny and all that, and it seemed like this was really what the Christian church wanted as well, and so it seemed like something everybody could kind of, get excited about, with a few notable exceptions, among them Karl Barth, who saw straight through Hitler. He knew exactly what that man was about, And so the Barmen Confession was a theological, it's not like a political attack. Hitler's never mentioned by name, Nazis are never mentioned by name, but it's clearly attacking the rising Nazi movement and critiquing the whole Christian world in Germany that was endorsing Hitler. I mean, it was really quite a piece of work. And so Barth, by the way, Barth was the chief author of this document, the Barmen Confession. He had, of course, it was a committee effort, but he was the one who wrote the bulk of it. Barth signed and addressed personally a copy of this to Adolf Hitler, lest anyone doubt his willingness to. He was kind of like the John Hancock, on the Declaration. It would have been as Karl Barth. It was big and bold, and no one doubted where he stood. This became a founding document for a movement in the German Christian world called the Confessing Churches. So if you ever study Second World War in greater detail than you have here, you should hear of the confessing churches in Germany. The confessing churches were a minority who were stalwart in their hostility to the Nazi movement. Other names connected with this, most importantly, would be, of course, who? Let's see. Jordan, what's the other major name associated with the confessing churches in Germany back in those days?
Bonhoeffer?
Bonhoeffer, certainly. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth were pretty close associates at times. They differed, they parted company along the way over some, what we might consider somewhat subtle theological issues, but they always had a real appreciation for each other. In 1935, Barth was basically fired from his job as a professor of theology in Germany, and the reason he was fired was because he refused to swear allegiance to Hitler, which every professor in Germany at the time was required to do. It was dicey. I mean, that was an act that could have gotten you shipped off, to some concentration camp, but it was early enough that the concentration camps hadn't become the device par excellence to deal with your enemies. And so what happened to Barth was he was basically exiled. He was, exiled back to his own home, so he went back to Switzerland in 1935, and he took a job as a professor of theology at Basel, the University of Basel. That's where he spent the rest of his career. 1935. There's a famous little story. Of course, remember, Switzerland was the one nation that was not invaded. It's this little yellow island here. This is a Second World War map. And this is the one that the Germans didn't mess with. And when Barth was given this job at the University of Basel, there was a little kind of questionnaire he had to fill out, or I guess an interview. He had to answer some questions. And one of the questions that was asked him was whether he supported the Swiss national defense. And the Swiss national defense, of course, was the policy in Switzerland that if somebody breaks into your country or breaks into your house, you shoot them dead. And you do it because you have demonstrable competence in using a variety of weapons, and you will use them. You know, that's kind of... And Barth was always sort of known as a pacifist, and so it was not altogether clear what response he would give to that. And his response was, quote, "Yes, especially on the northern border." And you'll notice the northern border of Switzerland is Germany. So he was quite prepared to use force. And so I think you'd have to say that for Karl Barth, he was more of a just war, ethicist, although he certainly favored peace, which I hope all of us do. But nevertheless, he wasn't above using force, especially on the northern border, if the necessity presented itself. The most famous work that Barth produced is called Church Dogmatics. It is a 13-volume work, and he died before it was finished. It's about 6 million words.
I think I've ever even spoken 16 million words.
6 million, yeah. That's right. The whole class wants to weigh in on that question. I remember, some of you know the name Dale Bruner, who was a theology prof out at Whitworth for many years, very popular, great guy, retired a few years ago. And his wife, Kathy Bruner, I was in some gathering with them once, and I remember her saying that she really resented any theologian who would write more in a lifetime than anyone else would normally read in a lifetime, and that was kind of the way it was with Barth. He wrote more than most people read in a lifetime. These 13 volumes, by the way, are not little volumes. These are huge, honking things, And the terminology for the Church Dogmatics is each volume is a multi-volume set. So you've got Church Dogmatics 1:1, Church Dogmatics 1:2, 2:1, 2:2, and so on. So what I'm saying is the total of those is 13, but each one is a pretty good sized volume. And the way they read is you've got sort of larger print followed by extensive fine print footnotes in which he would clarify. So you can read the Church Dogmatics and you can just read the major print and it'll go along somewhat more rapidly. But if you really want to find out what he thought, then you go into these extended kind of fine print sections where he would just give all kinds of justification for the whatever statement he was making at that point. So it's quite a piece of work. The first of these was published in 1932. He was still working on it by the time of his death in 1968. Have you read the whole set? No. I have read certain parts of it. Barth, you know, I hope you'll all have a chance to read a little bit of Barth at some point. I actually taught a class in the fall, a master's level class at Whitworth, with a group of 6 students. These are MA students in theology. And it was readings in Christian theology. And so we read in the course of this class Luther, Calvin, Jonathan Edwards, Karl Barth, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So that was our reading. And so we read a fair amount of Barth. And I have to say, I actually felt better about Barth after I hadn't read a whole lot of Barth. And what I had read were the parts that most people viewed as the basis for criticizing him, you know. And this particular volume, I had to say that, you know, I came away from reading it with the deep conviction the man is a genuine Christian. I don't have any doubt of the state of his soul, at least based on reading him. He has the faith just kind of shines through. I disagree with him, as you probably can guess, in his treatment of the scriptures, but I also kind of understand it. I can see where he sees this risk, this danger of he doesn't want to give any beachhead for human wisdom to intrude on the majesty and the holiness of God. He doesn't want to have any confusion there. And of course, he's living in a culture which had made that confusion virtually an idolatry, you know. And so he actually blames people like us who cling to things like biblical inerrancy and so on as being that little beachhead where human wisdom starts to make its intrusion into Christian thought. And he just wants to build a big bulwark there and say God is wholly other. And true deep revelation only takes place when you encounter God in Christ. You can talk about it, you can put words on that experience, but you can't call those words revelation. Revelation is something God does to you, not something God says to you, you know. Well, I don't agree with that. But I kind of appreciate why he said it. I think he saw the boogeyman in the closet that could come out and gobble us up if we made too many compromises, you know, with human wisdom. Did you guys have boogeymans in your closet when you grew up? You know, the boogeyman in the closet? Or maybe he was under the bed? The boogeyman under the bed? All right, let me try to wrap this up. As I say, he died in 1968. By the time of his death, he was a person of worldwide fame, and a huge amount of respect was, Nicole, you want to celebrate my birthday, don't you? Yes. That's just fine. Go right ahead. As she's doing that, let me put some kind of final little bullets on the board here that I think summarize some of the major themes in Barth, and then we'll leave him behind with this. First thing off, Barth is anti-apologetic. Barth is very concerned about any attempt to marry philosophy and theology. I'll grab that. He is wary of attempts to marry philosophy and theology. In terms of the tradition that we've talked about, if you remember Tertullian on the one hand and Clement of Alexandria on the other, he stands solidly with Tertullian. What has Jerusalem to do with Athens? You know, that idea. You who are taking apologetics, and you're familiar with the distinction between evidential, oh, those look wonderful. You're familiar with the distinction between evidential and presuppositional apologetics. Karl Barth would represent a radical presuppositionalist. He has no place, no time, no interest in evidential proofs for the Christian faith. He thinks that is an intrusion of human reason. He doesn't want to hear about archaeological evidence in support of this or that biblical event. He doesn't want to hear any of it. He thinks as soon as you even give that much room to human wisdom, it's a slippery slope, and it's only a matter of time, and you're going to be building a god to human wisdom. So he's anti-apologetic. Just preach the word. Can I have one? Yeah. I don't know. Just preach the word, he says, it is self-authenticating. The Apostle Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God unto salvation. You preach it, it hits people right between the eyes. And so he doesn't want us wasting our time trying to prove to people things like there's a God in heaven, proofs for the existence of God, proofs for the resurrection of Christ, proofs for the authority of the Scripture, any of that stuff. He doesn't want to mess with it. He believes you just preach, and the preaching itself will convert. No proofs, just preach. That's right. Secondly, he is Christocentric. Jesus of Nazareth, Barth says, is the way. He doesn't simply show the way. The Bible shows the way to Jesus. That's the deal. That's why the Bible is not revelational. It points the way. It's a faithful witness to the way, but it is not the way. Christ is. Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus will authenticate himself. The Bible will bring you to Jesus, and Jesus will convince you that he is who he claims to be by a personal, immediate encounter with the living Christ. He is anti-impartiality. There's nothing neutral. There's no neutral fact. There's no tabula rasa. No common ground with paganism. He is existential. As I mentioned to you yesterday, he was heavily influenced by Kierkegaard. And in some ways, Kierkegaard doesn't go as far as Barth, but he kind of points the way toward Barth. Because Kierkegaard, as you recall, was objecting to this kind of frozen, institutional Christianity. People go to church. It's just a matter of being good. If you're a decent human being, then you're a Christian. You drive the speed limit, you pay your taxes, you don't beat your wife, You're a Christian. It's just a matter of living a decent life. And you're fine. No crisis, no personal encounter with Christ. It's just being a nice person. That's all there is to it. That's all that matters. Kierkegaard was all over that. He was attacking that viciously. That's part of his teleological suspension of the ethical. You've got to suspend being a decent person. You've got to jump in to the other end of the pool. You have to sort of be in the conflict, the crisis of encounter with Christ to really be a Christian. Well, Barth takes that ball and just runs not only down the field with it, he runs right into the next football field with it. I mean, he's scoring touchdowns 10 miles away with that ball. He goes way beyond Kierkegaard, in my opinion, in making that case. And that's really what I mean by the existential aspect. He's all about you having a personal, immediate, present tense experience of, knowledge of, encounter with the living Christ, and that's the heart of Christianity. Not just having a little information in your head, you know. He believes the Bible is the most important book in the world. Now this is where you have to be very careful, because I've emphasized that the Bible, according to Barth, is not revelation. The Bible, according to Barth, is not infallible. The Bible, according to Barth, is not inerrant. It has errors. It is fallible, according to Barth. This is still that little bit of liberalism in it. That's why evangelicals tend to be suspicious of it. That's why Francis Schaeffer is pretty hard on it, as we'll see when we get to Schaeffer. So I just want you to be clear about that. But having said that, Barth regards the Bible as the single most important body of literature ever, the most important document that you could ever read. He believes it is indeed food for your soul, and he believes that as you read it, you will meet Christ there. And that meeting Christ there will be revelational for you. And it's in that sense we can say the Bible becomes revelational. But it's only revelational because Christ is in it. And so I remember one Barthian theologian I studied under once upon a time said, by the way, he's a Barthian, he followed Barth, so he said this with some degree of positive opinion, that the Bible, Stephen, don't die on me, man. What'd you put in these? This guy said, the Bible is a fallible finger pointing to an infallible truth. All right? And the image he used was some old guy with arthritis. Thankfully, I don't have arthritis yet, so I can't illustrate this, but my time may be coming. I am getting older, after all. But if you can imagine, you've seen people with arthritis, right? And their fingers all gnarled and kind of, looks bad. It's kind of sad, and and I hate to say it, but that lies in the future of some of you in this room, and some of us will be there. Well, anyway, if you can imagine this gnarled finger, arthritis has taken its toll, but it can still point, and it can still point in a way that faithfully directs your attention to that which is ultimately true and reliable. So he's saying the Bible is like that gnarled finger. It's got problems, but it's pointing to an infallible truth, namely Christ himself. So, that's Karl Barth. Jacob?
I'm just kind of interested in what that, yesterday you had that picture of him that was an article or
Right.
something.
Yeah.
What, from that kind of secular perspective, would they have to say about Barth?
That was a Time magazine article. It was back in the 60s when Barth came to America and gave a series of lectures at Princeton and a couple other places. And it made quite a splash, and Time magazine did a major article on him. And it was written in the way you might expect from Time magazine. They really celebrated what a courageous character he had been in the Second World War. They talked about how he had really reinstated some respectability for what people regard as Orthodox Christianity, that Jesus really is God incarnate, he really did die an atoning death, and so on. And at the same time, Time magazine, exercised a certain amount of criticism. I think, on the whole, it was a pretty good article. I think it was fair. But it was written from the point of view of someone who was not a great, devotee of Barth. It was just kind of your typical news review of him. All right, my friends. See you later. you.